All right, everyone. Good morning. Welcome back to the Exodus podcast. Again, this is the voice of Cameron Durr. Unusual host today, but I'm down at the Total Archery Challenge at the Exodus booth. Last day 4 of the shoot, and I'm joined by a good friend, David Powell. David, how are you?
I'm well, Cameron. How about yourself?
I'm doing pretty well. It's a little chilly this morning.
It is.
A little windy. I feel like the truck's not going to be won on a day like today.
You never know.
But I have David sitting here. And, David, why don't you tell everyone a little bit about yourself that may have never heard of you?
So I grew up in West Virginia and hunted whitetail from a very young age, primarily with a bow. I decided several years back if I was going to pursue the age class of whitetail that I was really hopeful of harvesting, that I needed to begin to hunt places where that age class existed. And so several years ago, I began to hunt in Kansas. One thing led to another, and the folks out there just kind of took me in as one of their own. They almost adopted me. And so not too many years ago, I officially became a resident of Kansas. Though I still maintain a home in West Virginia, Kansas is my residence now.
I'm pretty jealous about that. I can't lie. I drew my first Kansas tag this year, so looking forward to see how that goes.
It's a special place as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
So I make my living as a business manager in the environmental arena, and I have that keeps me very busy. But it has also afforded me opportunity to travel quite a bit, and I have some very understanding business partners and bosses, and it affords me the opportunity to spend some time in the out of doors. This is my 33rd TAC event this weekend.
Wow.
But I'm not really a target shooter. I do these sorts of things to better prepare me for the whitetail season and other big game season, archery season.
And you're quite a bit of a tinkerer, would you say?
You could say that, yes.
Yeah. And you have a pretty interesting product with the extra yardage wheel.
Well, I came up with that because I had a need to. I would set my bow up to hunt, and then I would also set up a different arrow combination, usually for these TAC events. And then sometimes I would set up a second or third arrow combination for TAC just for the truck shoot.
Yeah.
And it was difficult going back and forth, changing sight tapes all the time. And so I wanted a way that I could just change the wheel and leave the tapes intact and shoot the same sight basically, but use different arrow profiles. And that led me to the extra yardage wheel.
It's a really cool. It's very simple, but it's a very cool product that does fit a need. And I feel like a place like this, people would definitely benefit from that.
So I'll tell you this: 3 years ago, I brought the first one that I built. It was not intended to be for sale. It was just for me. I brought it to this event here in Pennsylvania, and people would see it and they'd say, "Hey, where'd you get that?" Well, I made that. Wow, would you make me one? And before I left here, I had 20-some orders.
That's fantastic.
So, I've been very fortunate. People, I don't necessarily make a living doing it, but it helps to offset some of the cost of my habits sometimes.
Sure.
But people around the world have kind of embraced them and begun to buy them.
Very cool. Speaking of being fortunate, you last season were very fortunate in the whitetail woods and killed a very rare whitetail.
Yes,
I would love to talk about the story of that, and we'll go to like what the deer is first, and then kind of go through the entire story of how that came about.
So the deer, I watched it for 6 years myself. I believe it was about 2.5 years old whenever I first noticed it.
And this is in Kansas, correct?
It was, yes. But upon harvesting the deer, it turned out to be a true hermaphrodite. It had reproductive organs of both male and female. That was a very, come to find out, that's a very, very unusual thing.
Yeah, that's, people see like cactus bucks and does with antlers and bucks that maybe have lost their testicular organs and can't reproduce or whatever. And they never shed their velvet, but this is a completely different thing.
It really is. And so when I first saw the deer, I thought it was, over time I decided it was an antlered doe. I had seen the deer over the course of 6 years urinate on more than one occasion, and it urinated like a doe. It had obviously had antlers, and they were very, very distinctive antlers, so there was no mistaking it was the deer.
Yeah.
But because of the hormonal imbalance and genetics, it actually had the reproductive organs of both, and it manifested itself in a lot of different ways. The body itself was fairly large, like a traditional buck might be, but the head and neck was always slender, like a doe. The neck during the rut would never enlarge. It was very. I mean, the different parts of the body almost looked out of proportion together.
Sure.
And then on top of that, there was this very unique rack. Now, when I shot the deer, I shot it in on September the 29th of 2022. It was still in velvet, but that deer would always shed velvet each year. It was just 2 or 3 weeks later than the other deer in the area. And it would always cast its antlers each year.
Really?
And I have several cast antlers that I've picked up, and I've got 2 matched pairs through the years.
Wow.
And then upon harvesting the deer, there's a man who used to work for the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. His name is John Ozoga. He did a lot of research and on a variety of topics, and he also wrote, I believe, for one of the big-name magazines back in the day. Mr. Ozoga is retired now, but he was kind enough to speak with me about the deer, and he has done some research into hermaphroditic whitetails. And there's a very small body of evidence, of course, or body of research, of course, but his is probably the most prolific. And he indicated to me that what I have shot is an extremely, very, very rare deer.
Did he have any sort of like percentages or likelihood or?
So, again, Mr. Ozoga is retired, and I'll try to paraphrase, but as close as possible. His words were, he doesn't use a computer. Most of his papers and articles were done typewriter or manually written, and he doesn't have a catalog system of easily referencing them, other than he has a stack, and he indicated he had a stack of about 300 papers on his desk, different articles on his desk, and he would have to go through them, and he said he could potentially come across those statistics because he's done the statistics in the past, but from top of memory and on the telephone conversation, he just indicated that it was one of the rarest deer that percentage-wise or statistically that anyone would have occasion to encounter, much less harvest.
That's really incredible. And when you think of rare deer, people will talk about like a Boone and Crockett deer or a 200-inch buck or something like that. We have like a totally opposite spectrum here. Was the deer scoreable by it?
So I had organized the taxidermist that I worked with organized to have the deer panel scored by Boone and Crockett and Pope and Young scorers, and the 3 of them got together. And on the appointed day, I arrived at the place. They already had the skull and the rack, and they told me that I could tell they were choosing their words very carefully. I think they thought I was going to be upset. And I follow those sorts of things pretty closely, and most people know that there is a typical category and a non-typical category for most big game animals.
Yep.
Unbeknownst to me, there is a third category out there. It's very rare, but it's called freak of nature.
Really?
And a freak of nature, they will not assign a score to it.
Oh.
And so I began to ask questions. Did you consider this? Did you consider that? They were the experts. They were kind enough to humor my questions. But in the end, I said, well, guys, between the 3 of you, how many whitetails would you say you've scored? And it was several thousand between the 3 of them over, 15 years for one guy, 20-some years for the other. Anyway, it was several thousand.
A lot of deer.
I said, so how many of them have you ever scored that fall into that category? They said, oh, David, you don't understand. This is the only one we've ever encountered.
What?
And then I went to the Pope and Young annual meeting, or biannual meeting out in Reno this past year, and I had some conversation with the director of scoring prior to. When I got out there, the scoring committee president and I had some conversation. He's been on the scoring committee for, I believe, 14 years. He's been president for the last few, and we began to talk about the category of freak of nature or whatever, and I said, well, how often? He goes, well, there are some specimens who have been placed in that. He goes, but as long as I've been affiliated with Pope and Young, I've never seen one.
So, like generational.
I guess so, yeah.
That is outstanding.
So it doesn't carry an official score for Boone and Crockett or Pope and Young.
It's just a freak of nature.
Deer's got, depending on how you categorize, 2 points down low around the bases. It's got about either 18 or 21 scoreable points,
Wow.
or non-scoreable points in this case. The bases are about a little over 15 inches in diameter.
That is insane.
And it was, I just felt very, very fortunate. It was a very, very special deer to me. I don't know if anyone else thinks so, but for me, it was a very special deer.
Well, it's a very special deer according to the world. I mean, there's only a very few of its kind. So you had a pretty long history with this deer.
I did.
And when you first discovered it, was it a yearling?
No, it was about 2.5 years old. I had access to, or have access to, quite a lot of property in Kansas, and I picked up a new farm one year in 2017, and was running a series of trail cameras, and in September of that year I did a card pull, and there was this very distinctive deer on there. And honestly, if you're familiar, if you think back in history, what like the barristers of England when they wore those powdered wigs.
Yeah.
This deer at that time looked like it was wearing a powdered wig. I mean, it almost looked like curls on its head. So it got my attention, and at the time I had 2 friends out there with me from Cincinnati. At one point in time, we'd all lived in Cincinnati, and we began to talk about it, and this deer has this very ostentatious headgear.
Yeah.
And we began to talk about Cincinnati, and someone brought up, and you're probably too young to remember this guy, but there is a funk artist from Cincinnati, Ohio, who was very big in the mid to late 70s. His name was Bootsy Collins.
Okay.
And one of the things that Bootsy is known for is very ostentatious hats or headgear. And somehow or another, this deer became known in 2017 as Bootsy.
Wow.
And again, we didn't know at the time. I thought it was just a very odd-looking buck, but through the years I began to realize. Then I thought it was an antlered doe, and then upon harvest, that was the first time I recognized that it was truly had organs of both.
So the first year that you discovered it, did you learn that it would shed its velvet, or was it still?
I did see it shed velvet, and it would actually visit a scrape. There was a communal scrape in the area that I had photos of it visiting. But it did not take part in. It didn't appear to take part in any of the rut activity on either side of that equation.
Yeah.
And then through the years, I began to realize that it was not only shed velvet, but it would cast its rack, and then I began to find a few of them, and I found one side of what I believe may have been its very first rack. It was an older rack, or it was an older shed when I found it. But it's small, but it's very gnarly, even at a probably for 1.5-year-old.
Yeah.
And then through the years, I started to really target trying to find those sheds, and I was very fortunate through the years to be able to pick them up.
Would you find them in a pretty similar area each year?
At first, the deer had a fairly wide-ranging territory, but as time went on, one of the things that was odd about this deer, I thought at the time, was by the 3rd week of October, that deer would leave. It would disappear on me. I wouldn't know where it went. And then I was able to pick up some additional property to the north, and I found that I was really originally on the fringe of that deer's home range. And as I picked up the property to the north, it became evident that I was now in the deer's core, and that's when I began to really find several of the sheds and match pairs and things like that.
So as time went on and you watched the deer's behavior, how did the other deer act towards it?
That's a great question. So this deer was something of a social pariah in the deer world. It would occasionally be a satellite to a doe group, but by and large, the bucks would keep away from it, and really the does would shy away from it too. If I would have pictures or video of other deer I might be watching at the time, and this deer would enter the frame, and those deer would kind of disperse, just drift away. Or if this, if I would find a group of, I saw 3 bucks chasing 2 does one time during the rut, and it was just mayhem running all around. And then out of nowhere, Bootsy begins to walk up the slope and walked right through the middle of all this going on at the same time, and had no interest in either side of that equation, and just continued on. And those deer kind of parted, let Bootsy come through, and then went right back to the business.
That's really interesting. With that being said, do you think it was easier or harder to target that animal when it was time to take it?
I felt like, so I watched it for several years before I decided it was time to try to hunt the deer, even though I knew the deer very well. In 2021, it had probably its best rack, and I decided, okay, I better do something with this because deer's getting older, and how long can I keep this thing a secret, et cetera. And so 2021, I was hunting a different deer. I had several cameras out, and the only photos I had in the early season of Bootsy were at night. And I had this true 190 inch 12 point on a different ranch I was chasing. I had photos of it during the daylight, so I decided that's going to be my target buck this year.
I probably would do the same.
I had to leave that ranch and go over to the other ranch one day for some just general maintenance and tend some cameras and some feeders and things. And when I got over there, I was just standing on this one ridge that I like to glass from, and it was November the 4th, and I saw Bootsy about a half a mile away on this ridge during the daylight. And at that point, from that point forward, I hunted that deer 54 days straight.
Wow.
And was unable to kill it. So on 2 or 3 different occasions, I was within range of that deer. One occasion, I had a shot. It was a longer shot, and the deer was moving through heavy timber, and I just didn't take it. It was 47 yards, something like that. And then on another occasion, I just kept trying to narrow this thing down, and I just felt like I was always a step behind the deer. And I just kept narrowing it down. And over the course of these several weeks, I finally decided this one area of the ranch, deer's got to be hanging out right there. And so I took a saddle and a platform, and I went in there. And I got to within about 40 yards of my intended tree, and I just stopped. And there was a wind coming out of the south. And I just stood there for probably 10 minutes, waiting, just watching to make sure that I didn't walk into the tree and blow that deer out if it was there. And I stood there, and finally I decided, okay, I'll move forward. And I took about a half step forward, and Bootsy rose up out of some oak brush, not 20 yards to my right.
Wow.
And I have to wonder how many times that deer must have lain there and let me walk by.
Yeah.
And I believe that had I not stood in one place for so long, the deer would have just let me walk by again.
Yeah.
But I believe standing there for so long and then finally moving, I think it just finally unnerved the deer, and it got up and ran. And I thought, oh, no, I'll never see the deer again now. I continued to hunt the deer, and I had it one more time in range that year from the tree stand, but I wasn't able to get a shot. There were some limbs in the way, and I just couldn't make it happen. So 2021 came to a close, and I didn't punch a deer tag for the first time in a long time. And in the spring of 2022, some folks affiliated with Exodus came out, and so John Haidt and Ryan Springer were out there, and we were shed hunting, and I took them over to the ranch where Bootsy's core area was, and I was kind of lamenting the fact, because they'd been helping me follow along in 21, making suggestions, well, you might try this, you might try that. And finally, Ryan, we were standing there looking around, and finally Ryan said, David, you see that tree over there? It's very thick in that tree line. And he goes, that's where you're going to kill that deer. He goes, if I was you, I would set up in that tree. I'd wait till the wind is right, not hunt the deer until the wind is right. And I'd slip in. You could come over the rise behind it, jump in the tree, and they'll never know you're there. And sure enough, on the second time I hunted that deer in 2022, in the exact tree that Ryan suggested, I was able to harvest Bootsy at 20 and a half yards.
That is amazing. So that was on a – did the deer follow like a bed to food, like kind of all the time?
Well, most of the year it was more concerned about bedding cover and then food.
Yeah.
Water a little bit, depending on, especially on dry years.
Sure.
But interaction with other deer and social activity with other deer, almost non-existent.
So targeting scrapes and things like that are not going to be the strategy for this deer.
The deer would come to this one particular communal scrape, I think, because it was lonely, not because it was there to leave its scent, or it didn't seem to bother the licking branches above like all the other deer would.
Yeah.
And certainly never saw it make any activity in the scrape itself. I think it was just lonely.
That's pretty – I mean – deer are kind of herd animals, and they do like to communicate. And it would, I mean, I just can't think of how the interaction between other deers would be, because, like, just think of breeding with does targeting a buck to breed with, or a buck to target a doe to breed with. Yeah. Could that deer be bred or do any breeding?
I can't address that, but I can offer this anecdotally. The deer on the tarsal glands when I harvested the deer, and I believe the deer was 8.5 years old when I harvested it. They were snow white. I've even young deer typically have some staining on the tarsal glands due to rutting activity. Interest in, even if it was capable, I don't believe it had interest in breeding it anyway.
And that's probably why other deer didn't have any interest in it.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's pretty interesting. So, like, when people talk about, like, annual data on a deer that you had 6 years of history, did that apply to this particular deer?
Even though it was not a social animal, yes. And that's how I was able to, once I got really in its core area, that's how I was able to begin to find those matched pairs of sheds.
So year after year, kind of in certain times of the year would target different parts of the farm.
It really would. And as the deer got older, I'm convinced that home range shrank even more. Had a neighbor to the west that has a small tract over there, and they were running some feeders, and they would, on rare occasions, and we're talking, this is about that particular ranch, the border from where Bootsy's core area was probably 1.5 miles, and they would occasionally, like maybe through the course of 6 years, once or twice a year, have a photo of that deer over there. And they were kind enough to send me a picture of Bootsy in 2016. That was before I ever even had access to any of that property.
So that would have been the year before you discovered it.
Yes.
So I was a year and a half year old.
They knew about the deer a year before because they had it on trail camera, but it just did not spend very much time at all off the place that I have.
On that north zone that you picked up.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So what would you say mile radius that the deer would travel?
Well, this particular area, I have about, I've got about, at one point had about 3,000 contiguous acres over there. I'm down now to 20-some hundred, but the deer would use probably a third of that, so about 1,000 acres. But its real core area was probably more like 75 to 80 acres.
So that would tell me, like, when bucks start roaming and trying to branch out, like, that deer just didn't do that.
It did not.
It just really didn't have any interest in anything other than cover, food, water, the essentials to live.
That's right.
So that's kind of, it's interesting. It's just like that deer is just such an anomaly. It's like, what do you even, I wouldn't know up until like you said, up until the point that you harvested it, you didn't know what it was.
No, not for sure.
So
I knew it was unusual. I knew it was rare, but I did not know exactly what we were dealing with.
So that doesn't kind of teach you, like, how to target the animal. For how many years did it take you to kind of figure out, like, rutting activity wasn't a way that you were going to target that
deer? About 3 years. I wasn't ready to start hunting the deer early on.
Sure.
But I certainly wanted to keep track of it.
Yeah.
And after about 3 years, I realized that it just doesn't take part in that.
Yeah.
At first, I just assumed it was an unusual deer, but I did not realize that it's even not only its appearance, but its overall actions and lifestyle were completely different than most deer.
Yeah. What was the body size of the deer when you harvested it?
The body itself, I didn't weigh the deer, but I would guess based on other deer I've harvested out there,
this is in Kansas. This
yes,
large body.
And, the Kansan whitetail is traditionally like the second or third largest bodied whitetail in the overall subspecies of whitetail north to south. I would say this deer was probably, it was 200 pounds.
Yeah. I mean, that's a pretty large, and that's an 8-year-old deer, though.
Yeah.
So yeah. I guess an 8-year-old buck would probably weigh quite a bit more.
It's not unusual to have deer in well excess of 200 pounds on the hoof if it's a mature buck out there.
Yeah.
So as time went by, that deer, it became very evident that even though the body was bigger, the neck and head, as I mentioned earlier, just never matured in the way that a buck would. it was just a very, you could tell if you really started to study and look at history that something was very unusual about the deer.
Could you tell anything from like the hoofs of the deer that like were you able to follow a track ever and be like, there's something a little bit different about that?
I got to tell you that, you know, I look for tracks. I'm not the best tracker. Some of these guys that are out there are amazing, and I wouldn't say that I could hold my own with those guys, but I had the ability to recognize one of Bootsy's tracks. I believe it was the right rear on occasion. There was a pond area that sometimes Bootsy would be at, and the way that I was able to really pinpoint that, I had a camera hanging over that pond at one point, and I had pictures, and I went there the next day and saw where the deer had been standing, and there was a, so one of the hooves turned outward on the back right side, on one side of the, I guess I'll call them toes, I don't know. But one of the toes on the back right side turned outward somewhat.
Okay. So it was a little bit identical, but there wasn't anything like odd about it.
No, not other than that. I wouldn't say so.
So the moment that the harvest comes,
Yeah.
the year that it's time to target it and the harvest comes,
Yeah.
what was that moment like?
That was very special to me.
Yeah.
So I will say I shot that deer with an Exodus MMT arrow.
Oh, yeah.
And about a month, maybe 6 weeks before I actually harvested the deer, I saw the local game warden at a restaurant one day, and he was having lunch, and I said, hey, I'm after a pretty unusual deer, and if there's some way that I might happen to harvest this, I'd like the opportunity to call you because it's going to come to your attention one way or another. You might as well hear the story firsthand, and I'd like you to be, because you know how rumors are.
Sure.
And he said, well, if I can, you call me. If I can, I'll come out. And true to form, I shot that deer at just a few minutes after 6 on the 29th of September. I stayed in the tree about an hour. A little after 7, I got down. I found my arrow, and there was a bit of blood where the deer had stood before it very calmly walked into the woods, even after being shot. I called the game warden, and he had just come in from a long day. I'm sure he was at home. He had just come in, and he was gracious enough, though. He said, give me a few minutes. I'll get my boots back on, and I'll be right out. And we arranged to meet up at the ranch gate, and he came out. And I had also, the second call made was to a tracking dog. I didn't want to take any chances because there were coyotes in the area that evening. Didn't want to take any chances. And so Lucas Mott brings out Baxter, his tracker, and we all converged at the gate about the same time, and I took him up to the area, and we popped up. And then the game warden's running body camera, and I expected it was an antlered doe, and then when I went to do the field dressing, I realized, wait a minute, there's much more here than what we thought. And so the field dressing process turned into a rather amateur, I will admit, but kind of a necropsy.
Yeah.
And he was able to film nearly all of it and document that we had organs of both and things like that.
What was his reaction?
He said he had never encountered anything like that at all. And he had a meeting the following day with some biologists and some other game wardens in the district. And he goes, those guys are not going to believe this.
It's like unbelievable to even think that that's possible. But it's the wild. That's what.
So I was incredulous. I just didn't. I wasn't even really sure what I was seeing as I was going through this process, and I realized there are other organs here, and there was a point in the body cavity where it looked like the small intestine, the urinary tract somehow converged at the bladder. But I don't believe, I believe that the majority of its, when it evacuated itself, was primarily through the female anatomy.
Yeah. So the spot that Ryan picked out for this area, you've been hunting that deer for how long, right?
Well, I've been watching the deer for 6 years, and then I was hunting it hard for a year and a half.
What was What was special about that location that Ryan was like, that's like instantly just that's the spot?
I almost felt embarrassed. But it was literally one of these things where you couldn't see the forest for the trees.
Yeah.
I was so focused on the deer that when Ryan pointed out the scenario, it was so obvious that I should have picked up on it. But so there's a ridge that runs east-west, and the deer had a propensity to bed to the southwest of this ridge. And there was a roadway I could come in out of the gate, a long way in there, but then up over this, through this drain and up over the ridge and get into some pin oak trees just at the top of that ridge. And when we were standing there, and the leaves hadn't come out yet, and Ryan's looking along, and there's this thick place he pointed out. He said, look, those trees right there, and you see the thick place. There's not even any leaves on it yet, and that is thicker than all the rest. He goes, I believe if you get in that spot right there, you'll have, and there were deer trails that crisscrossed right in front of the area. And he said, that's where I would get. And then he said, I believe if you get in that tree, you'll kill that deer. But he cautioned me, don't go in there and hunt that deer until things are right. And as much as I wanted to, season opened on September the 12th that year, and I wanted to be in there. Wind wasn't right, and I stayed out and stayed out. On the 21st, I went in and hunted that deer for the first time. And I was getting ready to put my sticks on the tree and climb up. I made a little tiny bit of noise with the stick on the bark of the tree. And lo and behold, Bootsy stands up out of a bed about 50 yards away.
Wow.
And I thought, oh no, this is about to happen. So I kept the tree between myself and Bootsy. I knocked my Exodus arrow, and I'm just standing there waiting to see what's going to happen next. And I think, as I mentioned, I think Bootsy wanted social interaction, and I think Bootsy may have thought there was another deer over there. So after a few moments, it began to walk straight to me. And it walked to within 42 yards. And I eased out around the tree, ranged it at 42 yards, but it was a head-on shot. And I know it's a lethal shot, but I just didn't want to take the chance on this particular deer. And so I passed a shot, and it stood there for a while. And then it turned around. It walked right back through the same trail that it had come in on. And I believe it even stepped in the bed that it had gotten up out of and just disappeared, kind of vaporized into the woods.
Did you continue to hunt after that, or did you leave?
Well, I went ahead and got in the tree that evening. And, I didn't know if the season was already over before it got started.
Yeah.
But, and then the next day I had to go to California for work. And so I took off, and then it was on the 28th. I was in LAX getting ready to fly back to Kansas, and my phone went off, and I looked, and it's Bootsy standing in front of my Exodus camera. And I'm sure the people around me were looking, what's this guy up to, But I was pretty excited.
Yeah.
And so the next morning, I had a meeting with my boss, and it was a Teams meeting, and I thought it would never end. And eventually it did, and I had a little bit of time left. I jumped in the truck and ran back out to the ranch and went up that little drain that Ryan suggested, popped over the hill, and climbed in the exact pin oak that he suggested. And I was hunting out of a saddle, and I was in the stand maybe 45 minutes, and just a few minutes before 6, I began to see movement out there, and it was Bootsy's very distinctive rack coming through the woods. Took it a while, and about, I believe it was, I think it was 4 minutes after 7 or something like that, the deer came to this crossroads in front of me at 20 and a half yards, turned to the northwest and gave me a broadside shot, and I was able to, it was all I could do, but I was able to hold it together momentarily and get an arrow into it, and that was very special to me. When
you approached that evening, were you considering that deer was in that same bed that you had bumped it out of? Well, it was a south wind that evening, and as I said, the ridge I was coming up on this ridge to the north of where it usually bedded, and it was coming out of the south that evening, and oftentimes on a south wind, the deer would bed in this one group of pin oaks on over maybe 3/8 of a mile or so. And later, after the fact, I pulled some cards out of cameras, and I had a picture earlier. It was like it was maybe 20 minutes till 5. That deer had stood up and gone in front of this one camera that I had over a bedding area, and Jay hooked back. It was going into the wind, and Jay hooked back and came back up, and eventually, about an hour later, was in front of my stand with an arrow on its way. Wow, that's pretty cool. So prior years, how far off were you from that distinctive area? As before I picked up the additional property? No, from like where Ryan picked out when you were hunting it. How far off were you? I spent most of my time about
I had several stands in a drainage about 300 yards to the north of that.
Okay.
And the deer did frequent that area, and that was where the pond was that I would get some pictures, and that was where that communal scrape was, that though the deer really didn't participate in the rutting and scraping activity, that it would come to, I believe, for social interaction.
Sure.
And so I had some photos of it over there, and I thought that was the place. But in hindsight, Ryan nailed it.
Well,
there's a reason. He's very accomplished.
Yeah, Ryan's the real deal.
Yeah.
What was the access like from where the deer was on, and when you accessed from the first spot where you were hunting?
Mm-hmm.
Were you walking past that deer?
I believe that I was down gradient in this drainage. The deer would bed up nearer the top of this drainage, it turns out, particularly on the south wind. And that's where the deer came from that evening that I eventually shot it. And I was counting on the fact that it would make its way down this drainage kind of crosswind, hoping it would come to me crosswind in years prior. But it just didn't work out that way. And when I look back on the 2 encounters that I had with the deer, maybe 3 encounters I had with the deer in 2021 during those 54 days, it was more in the area where Ryan had suggested.
Wow. 54 days straight.
Yeah.
And you had how many encounters?
3.
3 encounters.
Mm-hmm.
What kept you in that spot?
I knew the deer was there and had been there for 6 years.
Yeah.
And I was really concerned that I didn't know how many more opportunities I was going to have at the deer, whether through age or predation, or even though it's a large piece of property and the deer rarely strayed off, it could have easily made its way elsewhere. And so when I felt like I needed to get it done whenever it was right. Now, I will say, the 2022 rack, though I'm very pleased with it, I would never disparage it in any way, it was not the rack that we had in 2021. But we had a very harsh drought in 2022. We had the last measurable rainfall on July the 3rd, had about 3/4 of an inch on July the 3rd, and then up into September, mid-September, we had another sprinkle. But in between, we didn't really have any measurable rainfall in the meantime. I think that the dry probably had an effect on the available food sources for the deer, and the fact that it was getting on in years. And then one last thing, the 2021 rack that I found in spring of 2022, I found them together, fairly close together, about 70 yards apart. But when I went back and looked at trail camera pictures, even though I continued to hunt that deer until December the 31st in 2021, the deer actually shed sometime between December the 12th and December the 14th. I had pictures of the deer on the 12th that had the rack. I had pictures of the deer on the 14th and didn't realize until after the fact, and it had already shed.
Wow.
And so I don't know if maybe the deer wasn't in the best of health going into 2022.
Yeah, that's fairly early.
Because it shed very early, and even though that deer was off schedule-wise from most of the other deer in the area, it never shed that much earlier in the past that I could tell. And so I wonder if I wasn't sure exactly what was going on, but health-wise, age-wise, and drought, I think contributed to maybe a little bit smaller rack in 2022.
Yeah.
But trust me, I'm very, very happy with it.
Yeah, that's an incredible story. I think, I don't know, it's just something that a lot of humans, a lot of hunters are never going to encounter. So it's very special animal. Couldn't have happened to a better guy.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Again, I don't know if your followers and your listeners are at all interested in this, but I will just say this, that for me, it was very special. I feel very blessed, and it was kind of the deer of a lifetime for me.
Yeah, 100%. Before we wrap up here, what is the plan for this upcoming season?
Well, I spent so much time focused on Bootsy. I've got cameras running. I have a pretty good deer that's working through the area. He's kind of on another track, but adjacent to this track so I've got access to both. But I'm really hoping to go back and relocate that 190 that I was hunting in 2021.
Oh, yeah.
And maybe get back on that deer somewhere along the way too. Have some friends that were supposed to come out and hunt with me this year, and we've got some cameras down in a pinch point that they were really hopeful about, where they'd seen a nice, probably mid 170s deer last year. Neither of them drew this year. So I'm going to keep track, kind of keep tabs on that deer, but I'm going to try to get back on that, what was previously a 190. I don't know if I have lost history with it because I was focused so much on Bootsy, and I ran ran 23 cameras just focused on Bootsy in his core area. And so I pulled all my assets from all the other ranches.
Sure.
But we'll see what I can find.
Cool. Well, I look forward to following along. I think everyone else within the Exodus crew does too.
Thank you.
Appreciate the support that you have given us.
Yeah.
And I think you have a course to get on.
I'm going to shoot Sitka this morning and hopefully come back with at least 1 or 2 arrows left.
If not, we'll build you some more.
I trust you will.
So for anyone that may have interest in learning more about Bootsy or you yourself, where can people find you?
You know, I've got a little website. I've got go to Instagram. You can go to Long Range Archery Solutions, and you'll find a little bit about me and a few photos of Bootsy. And then there's some information on there about our extra yardage wheels. Reach out. I'm like most deer hunters, and I like the opportunity to swap stories.
Cool. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
And shoot straight.
Will do.